This video is going to be the third in my series of Beatle albums, stereo versus mono, in which I discuss and try to determine which version of the album I like better, the stereo version or the mono version. And today I am going to be talking about Meet the Beatles. And you might be wondering, I just did a video on With the Beatles, so what's the point of doing a video on Meet the Beatles, since most of the songs on With the Beatles can be found on Meet the Beatles, so isn't that kind of a duplication? Well, actually it's not, because the Capitol mixes that they did for the songs on the American Beatle albums by and large are different than the original versions that you find on the UK albums. Capitol threw a lot more reverb onto the stereo versions and just kind of beefed up the sound very artificially. It wasn't how the Beatles intended it, but they kind of tried to beef up the sound by throwing in a lot of reverb on the vocals and the instruments. So the versions on many of the songs do sound differently. So I'll talk track by track about the Meet the Beatles album and which version, and I'm going to be taking the Capitol version, and the versions that I'm going to be using are the true Capitol versions from the CD box set, the Capitol Albums Volume 1, because this is the only box set that contains the true Capitol stereo mixes on CD. This is the US albums, which is also a box set. However, the albums contain the mixes that were done from 1987, I believe it was, from George Martin. So they're not the true Capitol mixes, so even though the track lineup is the same, with small variations, like on Rubber Soul, they include the false start on I'm Looking Through You, and on I'll Cry Instead, they add the extra verse, which was the version that was on Hard Day's Night, but we'll talk about that when we get to those albums. So for today, I'm not going to be talking about the mixes that are on the US albums version of Meet the Beatles. I'm going to be talking about the version which is actually a smaller CD packaging of Meet the Beatles from the Capitol Albums Volume 1 box set. So just kind of starting off, this cover that they use is actually the mono cover. And as you can see, between the two versions, this is a larger CD case that they use. It does replicate the original Capitol album, and this one does to an extent. The only difference is on the back they show the track listing for both the mono and the stereo, but otherwise, for all intents and purposes, they look like the album. Another difference is that there's nothing on the spine of this one. This was the Capitol Album Volume 1. Not sure why they didn't print anything on the spine, whereas on the one from the US albums, they actually do have Meet the Beatles written on the spine. So I'm not going to use these mixes because these are truer to the versions that you find on the UK album. I'm just going to be talking about the true Capitol stereo mixes versus the mono mixes that you find on CD on the Capitol Albums Volume 1 box set. Are we clear? Okay, because this is what you would hear on the vinyl. I didn't do the vinyl because my vinyl versions of Meet the Beatles on stereo and mono are not in the greatest shape, and there's probably some pops and ticks here and there. So I'm just going to go with the cleanest version, the version that you're going to find on CD. So we're just talking about CDs here. So I listened to the stereo and the mono versions all the way through, and I took some notes. So the first track, I Want to Hold Your Hand, the version that I preferred actually was the mono, believe it or not. In the stereo version, I found that the reverb just overwhelms the song and the voices. It's just a little too much. It sounds really congested. It's just a lot of, I don't want to call it noise, but it sounds very busy. And I found the mono version, the vocals are clearer, the instruments are, there's a perfect balance between the vocals and instruments, where I just feel like the song gets lost in the reverb on the stereo version. So for I Want to Hold Your Hand, the mono version is the one I prefer. For I Saw Her Standing There, I'm going to prefer the stereo version. There wasn't the reverb added, so it was a much more enjoyable listening experience. I felt that there was good separation between the vocals and the instrumental backing. So for that one, I'm going to go with the stereo. The mono just sounded like a softer, more muted version of the track. So stereo for track 2. On this boy, the vocals sounded better in mono, so I think it depends on what you're more interested in hearing. Definitely the vocals sound better in mono, but the instruments, especially the bass is much louder in stereo. The bass is much easier to hear. You almost can't even hear the bass in the mono version. The guitar, the acoustic guitar, especially the strumming and the intro and the strumming throughout, is much clearer on the stereo version. So for this boy, I'm going to go with the stereo version. I don't know why I keep holding this album cover up. I'm going to stop that now because it's annoying to me. I can imagine it's probably annoying to you. You know what album I'm talking about. Track 4, It Won't Be Long. I'm going to go with the stereo version on that. It just sounded more vibrant, there was more punch to it. The mono just sounded very one-dimensional. You could tell everything was just captured in one speaker. It really did nothing for me. The stereo just kind of jumped out of the speakers, the stereo version. Mono, it was like, it just lost some of that immediacy. So again, the stereo version of It Won't Be Long is the one that I prefer. All I've got to do, I actually like the mono version just because the vocal was a lot clearer and the instruments didn't detract from the vocal. And the stereo, it was just like the instruments felt like they were competing with the vocal, and there was just kind of like this wall of sound that it just kind of got very jumbled. And you could really hear John's voice a lot clearer, and especially in a song like that needs to be softer. The stereo version just kind of overwhelmed the song, and it just lost something in the translation, I felt. So I'm going to go with mono on All I've Got to Do. For All My Loving, the stereo version is the one that I preferred. I felt the vocal and the instrumental track were both clearer in stereo. In mono, the double tracking was a lot more noticeable. I don't know how they achieved that mix, but I just felt like one of the vocal tracks sounded louder than the other, and it was just very distracting. You could definitely tell Paul's voice was double tracked, and it just kind of took something away from the song. So I'm going to go with the stereo version on that. With Don't Bother Me, the stereo version hands down on that one, although my only issue with the stereo version is it sounds almost like George's voice is quadruple tracked. It sounded like there were 4 George voices coming at you from all angles. But the thing about Don't Bother Me is everything about the instrumental track just jumps out. And in mono, the guitars just sound a lot softer. They sound more muted. They just lose a lot of their punch, where in stereo, it just kind of hits you in the face. So based on that, I've got to go with the stereo because I think it's just such a great instrumental track. I love the guitars on there, and I don't mind. George's voice is cool enough, even if it's coming at you from all angles. I think it's still great. Little Child, that is going to be another one where if you like the vocals, if you want to concentrate more on the vocals, the mono mix is the one you're going to want to listen to. Also, the harmonica solo was much clearer on the mono version. But in stereo overall, the instrumental track was much louder and much clearer, definitely much more pronounced. With mono, it just sounded a lot weaker, so I definitely preferred the stereo version. Till There Was You, stereo version hands down. There was a perfect balance of vocals and instruments. The instruments, the guitars, the drum, the bass, didn't overwhelm the vocals, and the vocals weren't too loud at the expense of the instruments. It was the exact perfect mix. Mono, with the vocal, there was definitely more separation. The vocal definitely stood out, and the instruments were just kind of in the background. The volume on the vocals is a lot, the volume on the instruments is much lower in the mono version. The vocal definitely is accentuated, but I still feel that the stereo was a better version because it was a perfect balance, and the instruments and the vocals were both at the right level. Hold Me Tight, the vocal is much clearer on Hold Me Tight, so if you're interested in just kind of concentrating on Paul's vocal, you'd be interested in the mono version, but the instruments again are very muted, almost like they were pushed to the background because they wanted to focus on Paul's vocal. In stereo, again, there was a nice balance. I felt like you could hear the vocal, but also the instrument definitely enveloped it in a good way, and you could appreciate both elements. With I Want to Be Your Man, I'm going to go with stereo again. There's a lot more immediacy to it. There's a nice balance between the vocals and the instruments, and just, that's a song where I think the instruments carry the tune. It's not so much the vocals, it's not Ringo's vocals, it's the backing instrument track. And so stereo definitely, that one blasts out at you, and it sounds a lot clearer and just a lot punchier. Mono, I'm just not impressed with that. The last track, Not a Second Time, I actually preferred the mono version of that. There's less reverb, it's not as noisy. The stereo version, there just seemed like there was a lot of reverb, it was just very noisy, just too much competing, the vocals seemed like, they were way too much reverb on there, the instruments, it was just sounded very busy. And I thought that the mono version did the song better, more justice, I guess is the word that I would use. So I think overall, if I had to pick one version, I would probably go with the stereo. I'm glad I have both versions because there were things I liked about the mono and things I liked about the stereo. But overall, if I'm going to pull one CD out to listen to, it's probably going to be the stereo version. So that's my verdict on Meet the Beatles. I'm curious what you think, if you've heard both versions, and maybe you agree or disagree on some of that, that's fine. Leave your comment below. Thanks again for watching. The next album we're going to do is another Capital American album. It's going to be the Beatles' second album. So thanks for watching. Take care, everybody.